No book in the Bible has withstood more scholarly criticism than the book of Daniel. That's because when you consider Daniel's message, you must either conclude that he came along after the events he described, or else God inspired him to write about those events before they actually happened.
The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. The prophet Daniel was a contemporary of the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel. He was carried off into Babylonian captivity in 604 BC and continued to live and write for a period of about 70 years. His book proves that God reigns supreme, even in the midst of powerful, world-ruling Gentile kingdoms like Babylon and the Roman Empire. His book also shows that God's people are always at the focal point of world events. Yet in listening to what some scholars are saying today, you would think Daniel was a great fraud and that his book was a work of fiction. Let's begin today over in Matthew 24. This is from the Olivet Prophecy from Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ here speaking in Matthew 24. And notice what he says here in verse 15. It says, "When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place," and then in parentheses it says, "Whoso reads, let him understand." So this Olivet Prophecy is perhaps the most famous prophecy in the New Testament, if not the entire Bible. Jesus Christ was talking to his disciples about the signs of the end of this age. And notice he mentions here this prophecy that Daniel referred to in Daniel 9 and Daniel 11 and also in Daniel 12. And it says there, "Whoso reads, let him understand." Notice that God wants us to understand these prophecies. Jesus wants us to understand these prophecies, not to reject them, not to ridicule them, not to say that there's just the creative work of a great imagination, but rather to dig into them and to study them so that we can know what's about to happen. Notice Daniel. Let's go back to the book of Daniel. Jesus told us to do this. And in doing so, he pointed to one of the great prophets, as he called him, one of the great prophets of the Old Testament, the prophet Daniel. And surely if there was any mix-up on when Daniel wrote it, or if it was some sort of pseudo-Daniel who wasn't really the Daniel of the Babylonian time period, then Jesus certainly would have cleared that up. Daniel chapter 9, in the mind of Jesus, obviously, the book of Daniel, Daniel's message, came with authority. There was authority behind that message, and Jesus acknowledged that right there in that Olivet Prophecy. And yet, if you look into Daniel's book, you can see this same attitude, where he looked to the words and the message of a prophet and really saw it as something that came from God, that God inspired. Look at Daniel 9 and verse 1. It says, "In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the seed of the Medes, which was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans." So by this point, Daniel covers, as I said at the start there, a period of about 70 years. He started writing it when he was a young boy, and it continued right on up through to him being an old man. And here he's an older man now, and still, notice the attitude that he took toward his studies. We don't have time to study Daniel chapter 1. Maybe we can do that at a later program. But it says there that Daniel was skillful in wisdom and cunning in knowledge. That's in Daniel chapter 1. And this was the approach that he took as a young boy, a teenager, as perhaps the top librarian in Babylon, who really not just organized the library, but he studied so many of those works. And here we are acquainted with him as an older man in chapter 9, and you see this same studious attitude. Verse 2 says, "In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of the years, whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem." Daniel understood this by looking into the books, by looking at the writings of the prophet Jeremiah in particular. He knew when the Jews would come back and rebuild the temple based upon prophecy that was covered in the book of one of his contemporaries, the prophet Jeremiah. Now, can you imagine Daniel saying, "Well, now I don't know about Jeremiah. I'm not sure if he's really a credible source. I'm not sure if he's reliable. In fact, I'm not even sure if Jeremiah actually wrote his book. It might have been someone who took on the name of Jeremiah. Maybe Jeremiah didn't even exist." Or could you imagine Jesus saying, "Now when you think about or prepare for the abomination of desolation, don't go back to the book of Daniel because he's not reliable, because that source comes from some spurious author who's a fraud and who wrote it some 400 years after he says he did." Of course Jesus didn't say that, and Daniel didn't say that either. But many people say it today. Many scholars believe that today, thinking that they know more than Daniel, that they know more than Jeremiah, that they know more than Jesus. This is a quote from the book, a new book called Jerusalem, Jerusalem, by James Carroll. Notice what he says about the author, the authorship of Daniel. He says, "The book of Daniel, anonymously composed during the thick of the Maccabean War, is chronologically the last book of the Hebrew Bible." This is what he believes. "We referred to Daniel earlier in reference to the war with Babylon, and it pretends to have been written then with Daniel," he has in quotes, "with Daniel identified as one of those in exile." So if you go to the book of Daniel, the author in that book claims to have written his text in the 6th century BC. But this author, the author of this book, along with many other modern scholars today, believe that the book was actually written in the 2nd century BC, 400 years on, around about 175 BC or so, when, as you heard there in the quote, the Maccabean Wars were going on. Now why, think about this for a second, why is it important for this scholar to try to establish a different time setting for the authorship of the book of Daniel? Why would he do something such as that? Why, if he doesn't believe that God inspired the Bible or the books of the Bible, why not just dismiss these books and walk away from it and say, well, the whole book is flawed. Why bother? Why bother with even looking into it? Why try to assign a different date for the book of Daniel, some 400 years later, written by someone claiming to be Daniel? The fact that these scholars fabricate new time periods for the writing of this book tells you a little bit something about the content of the book. Because if it was just the musings of some crazed fanatic, these wild prophecies that never did come to pass, well, any author, or rather any scholar, would just pick those apart and say, look at what this individual said or believed. And if it was at the time period that he says that he wrote it, that would make it all the more crazy when those prophecies didn't happen. But the reason they assign a new time frame for it is because the prophecies did happen. It is recorded history. What he does talk about in the book of Daniel did come to pass. And of course, he couldn't have written about any of those things before they actually came to pass. It had to have been after, because God can't inspire someone. God can't tell us what would happen in advance of it actually happening, could he? Well, most scholars would obviously say no to that. And so in their minds, it's obvious that it had to have been written much, much later. Either God, you see, either God is behind this book, either God is the one who inspired this book, or it was written after the events actually happened, a work of history, in other words. This is a quote from John C. Whitcomb. I forget the year that it was written. It was many years ago. But he's writing on this controversy, on why so many scholars want to try to assign a later date to when the book was written. It says, the book of Daniel has long been a battleground of biblical criticism. The reason for this is not to be found in the lack of historical information concerning the date and authorship of the book. There's plenty of evidence, in other words. He says, but rather in the very nature of the book itself. This is why it's a battleground. This is why it's so controversial for scholars, because of what the book itself says. He goes on and writes, he who thus finds his path blocked in his own peculiar conceptions, which eliminate both miracles and prophecy, must of necessity dispose of this book in some way. I mean, if you deny prophecy, if you deny that there's miracles, that God can perform miracles, then you have to dispose of this book, because it's too incredible to think about Daniel actually writing this in the 6th century, and then all of the detail that played out exactly the way he said that it would. Not just in those 400 years between 600 and 200-ish, but on through even to today. Look at Daniel chapter 10, verse 1. It says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar, and the thing was true, but the time appointed was long, or as it says in Moffat, the true revelation of a great conflict. It's a little awkward there in the King James, but it's a prophecy about this great conflict, this ongoing struggle, or this tribulation period, as Lang's commentary brings out, just to finish the verse. The time appointed was long, and he understood the thing and had understanding of the vision. And now going back to the start of verse 1 there, it says that he got this section of the prophecy in the 3rd year of Cyrus, the king of the Medo-Persian Empire. The 3rd year of this king, which would have been around 535 BC, there again in the 6th century, 535 BC. Now you can continue on in chapter 10, and when you get to verse 10 of chapter 10, that begins a vision or a prophecy that continues right through to verse 4 of chapter 12. It's the longest running prophecy in the Bible, spanning hundreds of years, and all kinds of details brought out in that passage, in that one prophecy, there from chapter 10 through chapter 12, and through it all, here is Daniel writing about these events well before they happen, talking about the development or the rise of the Greco-Macedonian Empire led by Alexander the Great after the fall of Medo-Persia, and then eventually the demise of Alexander's empire, or the splitting of that empire into his 4 generals. And then after that, he talked about these violent clashes that would take place between 2 kings in the Middle East, back and forth, and how that it would climax in this struggle led by Antiochus Epiphanes, coming into Jerusalem and just ransacking the city of Jerusalem and the temple and so on. All of this covered in advance and so accurately and with such precision and with so much detail. And he wrote about it. He wrote about it in the 6th century BC. It's just too incredible for scholars to believe, and so they push it back into the 2nd century. Now, even to this day, according to Jewish tradition, the Old Testament was finished and canonized and completed around about the end of the 5th century BC with the work of Ezra and others, and then that was it. It was done.